Right, well, how about this then? Obviously, this episode is not going to be one where we're sort of scouring tweets and Reddit. It's actually going to be one where, like, there's 3 playoff matches for LEC. We may as well do those. In doing them, we'll get through most of the different narratives, topics, etc., etc. But one thing we thought we'd do, it was Rich's idea, it's a pretty good one, though, I think, is being as playoffs is now here and we have the final 6 teams that are like active still in Europe, and we're going to find the 3 that'll go to Worlds. Obviously, any team that didn't make playoffs, their year is done now. Like, it's over already. They can all start looking either, do they have a team next year? Are they going somewhere in the off season? Well, the team that everyone's going to be thinking that about is obviously Schalke, because they are literally selling the spot to a different organisation, Team BDS, this French organisation. But the interesting detail is, if you watched the Crackdown episode with Dylan Falco, it basically is implied, and I'd heard similar things behind the scenes, that like it's not to be taken for granted that anyone with Schalke will actually be here for whoever the BDS team, whatever they call themselves next year with that slot. Like, maybe not the coach, maybe no players. It's possible they could choose to sign those players, so that could change. But as far as I know, it was implied to me like everyone's sort of either going to be released or go elsewhere. Like, that's just the way it's going to be. So basically, this is like an end of a type of an era, right? Whatever Schalke represents, it's over. So we talked a little bit about it on some past ones here, Rich. But what do you actually think the meaning of this is? Like, for example, I have to say, one thing is, I don't know German football, so to me, the Schalke angle was never like super significant. Like apparently to some other people, that was like a hype angle, you know? So to me, they were like a good team that often, like, you know, like I would say punched above their weight is the classic cliche from British sports punditry. I thought they were pretty cool all in all. A few arseholes worked for them, but whatever, it wasn't in the team usually. What are your thoughts on them as an actual org and what their legacy will be, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, see you later, Darius, little rat. No one's going to rehire that moron, so see him later. What a shame. I mean, it's a French org, so yeah, I think what Dylan says is probably pretty accurate. I think they will basically talk to everyone, and then if they believe, but not from the perspective of you currently have a space and now we're going to think about moving you on or not. But no, you're basically we're interviewing you, and if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. So even Dylan, who you'd have to say has done a pretty good job, at least holistically, sure, over his tenure, isn't secure a spot. The players, same. In terms of their overall legacy, I feel like, as you say, they'll be known as a team who overperformed versus, especially if you look at it from like a spend versus results perspective, they probably have the best, sure, outside of G2, because you could argue that even if G2 is the highest spending team, right, that their ratio of spend is astronomically high. So if we take G2 aside, Schalke, I would be pretty much certain, as I have a pretty decent idea of how much money teams spend on salary each year, would be the best of the rest. And, obviously made some really cool story.
I'll use the cursed term because it might be one of the only times it's applicable. They might actually be the team that did Moneyball. Like, aren't they actually probably the only one that's appropriate when you look like way better results than you'd expect? Like, as far as I know, it was basically implied. Like, I've heard some of the players they've gotten even big names didn't get that much money, It's like they got them all kind of usually where they were a bit desperate for a place to go,
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's like almost impossible to make a purist version of Moneyball work in League, just because there are so many infinite variables that it's insane. But I do know that Dylan at least had elements of that in his thinking when recruiting players. And I'd had conversations with Dylan or other people in Schalke when they were talking about their philosophy of how they were picking people. And he did often in certain areas, not in completely, but there were aspects of certain statistics and stuff which for him were personally really important. Whether he could marry those to certain success trajectories or whatever, I don't know. I haven't seen his stuff, but I know that he was actually pretty interested in that. And you'd have to say, if we're going by results-based analysis, that it worked for him, right?
Sure.
But yeah, I think they created some interesting storylines. Obviously, the Miracle Run was a really great subplot during that year. They were never really serious contenders to win anything, but that's not really surprising. And I do think star power is pretty important, at least in terms of being on the Rift, right? Not in terms of like, oh, this guy's got a big brand, but I do feel like you do need game changers, even as much as the game's kind of drifted somewhat away from like individual performance affecting game results. So they were never really in the position to do that, but I think they did close to, as well as they could, most splits for what they spent on it. And I think that's a pretty decent legacy to have. And what I would say as well, with all this information, constantly coming out year on year, I posted recently about, G2 lost 10.6 million euros, in 2019. They haven't even posted their 2020 results yet. Schalke were always a team who actually ran very close to net even, if not essentially net even, and were doing that at the same time. So that in itself is pretty impressive, though I'm sure most fans don't really give a damn about that.
What do you think, Wicked? What would the legacy of Schalke be for you?
Honestly, it's just that a football team was an LEC, and apart from that, I don't really care. Also, the last point you mentioned, that fans don't really care about the spending thing. I think the thing is, most fans actually don't know about that, right?
Yes.
And that's the problem. Like, I didn't know about that, and I'm actually pretty into League of Legends to some extent. So I think if fans knew about that, I think it would be much, much more important to them, and they actually care about it. But it's really hard because it's information they don't have most of the time, or it's information that maybe it's out there, but you have to look for it, and it's not in your face, right? So I think that's a big problem. But for Legacy, I don't really care too much about Schalke in that regard. It's just a football team that I was in, right? And I thought that was cool at the time. And I think the change is fine. It's not a big deal to me.
Yeah, I will say, this is one of those times where I do wish it was like football and you could just look up like the overall payroll and what everyone gets and stuff, because then you'd actually, basically it would make this point that Rich is making for us, which is if you look at like the talent they had in that team, but this way, I would phrase it like this. It looks like whoever the GM was of that team, I'd imagine it was different people over the years, looks like they got pretty much all the best transfers they could at that level at each time. Like, looks like every year with whatever level they were at, they re-upped pretty well. Like, I was just writing some down here. Like, think of some of these names they've had on the team, right? They've had like Vizicachi, Nukdok, Odoamne, Opset, Forgiven, Limit. Like, these are all players who like all LEC level talents at different points in time. Or Abadagi, obviously. Like, now, I'll even say, if you look at that, right, everyone might think on that list, one of those names doesn't belong. Actually, the point is, the Forgiven pickup, actually, in my opinion, shows what I think was good about this org. Because the Forgiven pickup, by the way, everyone now in hindsight would go, what an idiot. It's like, that's genius, because what they understood there, it's the reason why Dardoch has had 1 million teams in LCS, is every team knows, if I can make it work temporarily, I've got a way better player than I should have in this position. Like, the only reason people don't want them is because of external factors, not because of how good they are at the game. So, like, I even saw that personally when they picked up Forgiven as like a gamble to try and be an elite team. Like, and if, as far as I know from like what their setup was, like that's what everyone thought in the team at the time.
Yeah. Also, what I would say to add a bit of context to people who might have that opinion is, first of all, they were under like no illusions whatsoever. They weren't saying like stupid stuff like, "Oh, Forgiven, he's going to dominate every lane and win us the game," and who cares about reviews or player dynamic. Like, they came in like very wary and basically said like, these are the elephants that we're all aware in the room. We're aware that this is a big risk. We're aware that this could cause a problem, and we are aware that at a certain point in time you might be kicked from the team, but we feel that we have the right, because again, keep in mind, as you said, that Otto was there and Abadagi was not as consistent, or hadn't had his best moments yet, but was showing a lot of promise, obviously, and they thought this was like a coin flip for Worlds, basically, which is just, apart from anything else, financially a brilliant punt to take. Like, absolutely. And this idea that you might, cause certain amounts of disharmony or something of those, like, I'd take that. I mean, I did take that flip, right? I'd take that flip every time. So they weren't naive about this whatsoever. And yeah, I think that it was a smart decision. And also keep in mind that people forget, or maybe never knew, they were smashing everyone in scrims initially. And you could say when that stopped and when, Schalke didn't perform as well, it might have been, slightly to do with, Forgiven's unwillingness to move on certain champions or whatever. And people be like, oh, okay, this bastard's back and he's playing Caitlyn every lane again, so we need to adapt, and it took them time to adapt. I mean, you can say it happened for any myriad of reasons, right? But initially, it looked like really smart. And I'm sure there's a parallel world where it could have worked, right? So, yeah, I don't think that was like stupid on their part. And as you say, I think it's kind of indicative of the kind of decisions they were willing to make. And if you're a team who aren't going to spend that much money, the idea that you take a flip on an incredibly gifted player with the downside being problems rather than huge financial debt, that seems like a moment to pick your risk taking, right? Absolutely. In that context. So, yeah, I admired it at the time.
But also even now, I still think it's a good decision, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't really care if you're 8th, 9th, or 10th. It's completely irrelevant. No, like, I don't even know who's 8th right now. Like, I literally don't even know, right? So it doesn't matter. Nobody cares about it. And if you have a higher chance, even if it's a small chance, like if it's a 5% higher chance for making playoffs, that's worth it. Even if it's a gamble. And it doesn't really matter if a player is toxic, because if he's good at the game and you can handle it temporarily, toxic players tend to be good in a team temporarily because you haven't broken the team yet. You know, eventually they'll break the team, but
Yes.
as long as the team is together and works, because they're in the honeymoon phase, it's actually a good idea. I completely agree with that, and I've tried that before, right? So,
sure. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, you know, be a pleb and don't.